trying to think of a project I could do for this channel that involved 3D graphics in some way. Then I thought about the episode of Treehouse of Horror where Homer enters the third dimension. That led me to think about another yellow-skinned animated character we all know and love, Glynos from Adventures of an Antinatalist. Glynos is also the name of the YouTuber who creates the series, so I wanted to incorporate the real Glynos as well as his alter ego in this piece. The episodes of Adventures of an Anti-Natalist seem to be based on the life of the real Glynos, but exaggerated for comedic effect. And it's black comedy, which seems appropriate, and it's my favorite kind. The challenging thing about making a 3D version of Glynos is that he is drawn differently from episode to episode, whereas, say, Cartman from South Park looks exactly the same as he did 10 years ago. So far, he has not reused assets in the way that most animated shows do. Part of my job is animation pipeline efficiency, so I always have to come up with the most expedient way to get something done. Like, for example, I'm not going to bother making appendages or a lower body for this character model, since I know he's only going to be visible from the shoulders up. For animations of cars on the road, I put a human behind the wheel, but there is no reason for him to have legs or even eyes. I just put sunglasses on him as that's the easiest solution. The eyes often betray a digital character, which is why Neo and Agent Smith wear sunglasses in The Matrix. So I got the idea for this piece from an image on Glynos' Twitter page. It's the real Glynos standing next to a drawing of himself. As he's an English teacher, I assume that one of his students drew it. So I thought it'd be funny if the animated Glynos was looking at a piece of fan art, but drawn in a realistic style that resembles his alter ego / creator. So these are the tools I use every day at work. It's pretty difficult to make a living doing 2D ink illustration, and digital has completely overtaken commercial art now. Cartoons are mostly CGI these days. I didn't learn any of this at college. When I got out of school, it was only then that I realized that inexpensive home PCs were now powerful enough to run high-end graphics applications. I graduated in the same year that The Matrix and The Phantom Menace came out, so I began to get obsessed with computer animation. Computers became things that I saved up for and built myself to save money. Every couple of years I upgrade, and then the old PC becomes a backup or a render node. I currently have 7 machines throughout the house that can be used for network rendering. So the way I work is I get to a place I like, and then I send a render to the render farm, so I can keep working on my primary machine while the other machines draw it for me. That is one of the cool things about computer animation is you set everything up, but the computer really does the hard work. I just love, getting up in the morning and just seeing what it had produced for me. I'd always planned to make my own films, that's why I got into it. I didn't realize this had become my career until I saw that there was a demand for it. I'll fully admit that modeling is not my strongest skill set. If any modelers are out there watching, you can probably tell. At work I have someone who makes the models for me, and I like it that way. It's like being a kid and wanting to play with your toys, but first you have to build them from scratch. It's much more fun to already have your toys fully sculpted so that you can paint them and light them any way you want to. That's the fun part for me. Then there's also the photography aspect of this art form. I work with digital cameras and lights that simulate real-world physics. Although I prefer to turn the inverse square law off because it's much easier to light objects that way. So photorealism is my specialty. So if someone needs to put a building or a car in their footage, but they didn't record it, I can go in and put a digital asset in that will match the camera and the lighting. I live in the Detroit area, so 90% of what I do is car related. So even though this digital Glynos is a cartoon character, he is going to be lit with realistic, high dynamic range lighting. Like when Homer strolls down Ventura Boulevard in Homer Cubed. This is how high-end cartoons are made now. The characters are still cartoons, but their world is photoreal. Okay, so I have my 3D scene pretty much figured out now. Now it's time to make the picture that cartoon Glynos is going to be posing next to. You've seen me do these time-lapse drawings many times, so the only thing I have to say about this one is that I decided to leave Glynos' facial hair out of it, since I thought it would look weird for this cartoon version to have a 5 o'clock shadow, and I wanted them both to look similar. I've been using this program for about 20 years, and it's still my favorite. I also use Maya regularly as well, but I much prefer 3D Studio Max. You can create anything your mind can imagine with this software. I've done landscapes, digital humans, cartoons, logos, props, special effects, cars, spaceships, architecture, and much more that I'm forgetting. But in the end, it is simply another artist's tool, like a high-tech box of crayons. But getting back to 2D animation, I actually did one episode of a 2D cartoon a long time ago that is similar to Glynos' work. I wanted to see how hard it would be to make my own episode of South Park, so I used that style to make a story about some of my friends. The animation in South Park is famously simple and was originally cardboard cutouts animated with a stop-motion camera. I did it entirely in a program called After Effects. I'm not sure what Glynos uses for his work. It was fun, it turned out okay, but it took me much longer than I expected. I gave myself 2 weeks to do it, and it took around 3. So about 1 week for every minute of footage. It was only 3 minutes long. One thing that people don't consider about animation is that everything, including every prop and every sound effect, has to be created. The sad thing is I never made another one, even though all the assets were already made. It had a cast of characters with their arms and mouths all rigged for animation, but I just didn't have another story to tell and had other projects that I wanted to do. So I can appreciate all of the time and work that goes into Adventures of an Antinatalist. So Adventures of an Antinatalist is the story of Glynos, a British working professional who appears to be a teacher in the first episode. Although in episode 7 he appears to be working in an office space kind of environment. You can tell by the buildings outside of the window that he's in some kind of city high-rise or office building. So either Glynos has taken another job, or he's still in the school and his coworkers just happen to be other teachers. But that aside, he's probably a 30-something single male living in England, whereas the real Glynos is currently living in St. Petersburg, Russia, or Leningrad as it was called when I was a kid. Episode 7 is a great one, as Glynos has to deal with the expectation of a congratulations at a pregnancy announcement. For example, I am stressed out currently because a relative of mine just sent me her birth announcement via text, and I didn't know how to respond. I can't just say congratulations. I just can't, even though that's expected. So I just didn't reply. I know this will damage my relationship with this person, but it's better than me not telling her how I really feel. And that would be that she's evil and psychopathic, imposing life and death on an innocent person who never asked for it. It's truly disgusting to me. So in the end, I really don't care if she doesn't like it. I don't owe her anything, and there's nothing I need from her. Many of the episodes of Adventures of an Antinatalist show the awkwardness and the dilemmas that antinatalists find themselves in being around normals. Later in episode 7, Glynos goes to a vegan restaurant and meets a vegan girl who he begins to fall in love with, until he realizes that she is a pro-life environmentalist wacko, like the members of the voluntary human extinction movement. Nature worshippers, I suppose you can call them. They look at the world and see Ansel Adams pictures, not the murder and violence that's behind every leaf, and the misery and suffering that's under every rock. And besides that, if you even dig a little bit into Ansel Adams, you realize that he had to do the Photoshop of his day and paint out graffiti and shit and garbage and stuff that he saw at these places. This illusion people have of nature being perfect is just that, an illusion. Glynos constantly finds himself in catch-22 scenarios, where he just can't seem to win, even when he does. Like in episode 2, where after murdering his coworker for not understanding anti-natalism, he turns himself into the police only for them to let him go scot-free. One gets a sense that Glynos would rather be within the walls of a prison than have to deal with the idiots in the real world. Anti-natalism is itself a kind of catch-22, as one of the characters in that novel states, quote, "Catch-22 says that they have the right to do anything we can't stop them from doing," end quote. We know that procreation is wrong, but there's nothing we can really do about it. Glynos takes on many of the opposing forces anti-natalists have to deal with. Like in episode 2, the cop who interrogates him uses the subjective though fallacy to justify letting him go. In episode 3, a woman tries to justify procreation on the basis of tradition and laziness. She incidentally becomes Glynos' third murder victim as her head explodes from his relentless onslaught of logic. In episode 4, Glynos visits his brother who believes that he is being called a murderer by anti-natalists, which is essentially the truth, so he overreacts violently and stabs Glynos in the eye. In episode 5, Glynos is at the doctor's office where he encounters a pro-suffering physician. This doctor represents all of those who have experienced the horror of life firsthand, but yet are the most deluded of them all. So here Glynos is exploring the psychology of the natalist. I feel like Ask Yourself, a vegan YouTuber I've responded to a few times, fits into this category. He shows video of animals getting brutally abused and murdered, and yet thinks that life is an overall good and worth continuing. Even in the face of the horror, he chooses suffering over peaceful non-existence. So this all leads into my favorite episode, which is a 3-parter. Glynos' visit to a therapist. Part of the reason why I love this one is because I hate psychiatry with a burning passion, and that is partially due to my own experiences with it. After I stopped therapy, I did the research that I should have done before I stepped foot in one of their offices. I realized that psychiatry is a pseudo-scientific scam to make billions of dollars off of human insecurity and misery. The therapist fails to understand the position of anti-natalism and instead accuses Glynos of simply hating life because he hates his own life. This is a very common criticism of anti-natalists and is an ad hominem attack on the position. Also, ask yourself, this therapist is a moral subjectivist. He says that fairness exists only in our minds. This is actually a not-so-discreet parody of Corey Anton, the psychologist YouTuber, and there is a picture of Anton right above Glynos in this episode, and he later sets fire to it to prove that some things are objective. Episodes 7 and 8 are where the art style changes a bit, and Glynos has more of a round-shaped head rather than an oval. So that is where I got my inspiration from for this image. Episode 8 is especially one of the better animated episodes. The backgrounds are hand-drawn, the mouth movements are well synced, and the characters move their arms. Glynos is brought into his boss's office to be chastised for not saying congratulations to his coworker. The boss says that he has a bulletproof argument against anti-natalism, and that is extinction. Glynos laughs out loud because of course anti-natalists want all sentient life to go extinct. But it's the conclusion that pro-life natalists just can't accept, even though it would be objectively better than the current state of things. In episode 9, Glynos meets a positive or classical utilitarian in what looks like an oxygen bar. Classical utilitarians make the mistake of confusing relief from suffering with a true positive. An example of a classical utilitarian is Sam Harris. He thinks that joy, or pleasure, or as he calls it, well-being, brings a sentient brain above the baseline of comfort, when in reality, the sentient is always in a state of deprivation and need. The so-called positive is really just a return to a neutral baseline. This episode just shows that even though utilitarians are close to getting it, they're still so far away from understanding what life really is. This utilitarian becomes Glynos' fifth victim, as he gets him to agree that the pleasure he would get from killing an annoying person would generate more utility than avoiding his victim's painful death. And then the final episode thus far, published in 2017, is about interacting with parents and children together. This is the dreaded scenario for many anti-natalists, including myself. Many anti-natalists are also child-free and are uncomfortable around children. I get really depressed around kids because they do not know the suffering they're in for. They haven't yet seen the worst of life, at least most first-world kids. So I just see an innocence that is there to be destroyed. I love how offended the mother gets when Glynos mentions the word impose. This one is hilarious. The mother starts beating her child for crying, and in another catch-22, Glynos tries to interfere on behalf of the child, but then gets a black eye for his trouble. He expects a stranger and the police to help the child, but instead they blame Glynos for daring to reprimand a parental bully. So in the end, the natalists win, as usual. So now I'm compositing my 3D rendering in a program called Nuke. It's the industry standard, so every Marvel movie you've ever seen has been put together in this application. It was created by the visual effects studio Digital Domain. It utilizes the OpenEXR file format created by Industrial Light and Magic. So within this file, I not only have my RGB render, but I also have all my lighting, shadow, and reflection passes embedded within. And additionally, masks or mats for every element so I can isolate and color correct them individually. Then I always finish it off in Photoshop. I wasn't pleased with how the folds of his shirt around the neck turned out. It was a nice idea, but they ended up looking blocky, so I took them out. I used one of my own photos for the background. I decided to stop at 2 images and not go too meta on this by having Glynos looking at a picture of Glynos, looking at a picture of Glynos, etc. I just wanted to do a parody of the Twitter image. So thanks for watching, and make sure you subscribe to Glynos. He's one of the good guys. Links are below.